I see Tope is on. Author here.
Hey.
Hey, Zusi, I'll let you do your, jump in here. Hey, Tope.
Hello, Tope. My name is Zusi. I'm the founder of Jollof Gist. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for joining us today to discuss a particular kind of Black man. I think I speak for kind of most of us in this call when I say that this book really hits home. Many of us that grew up in the U.S. have gone through a similar journey that the protagonist Tunde went through in our search for identity. It's one of the reasons why Jollof Gist was founded in the first place, just to bring people of similar backgrounds together, to share experiences and grow as a community. So we really appreciate you for joining us, and we're excited to learn more of your thoughts while writing this book. So.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really so pleased that even in the midst of a global pandemic, you guys still care enough about my book to connect and talk about it. It means the world to me. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
Yeah.
This is why I'll let you take over.
Cool. Well, we're excited. This, I think, for all of us, this book took us on some emotional roller coasters, for sure. So we had a really good discussion before you jumped on, but I mean, people have a lot of questions, and we'll kind of get on more of that at the end. But so I just want to ask you some questions in general about the process with writing the book. I know you started, from what I was kind of reading, you started around 2012 with the book, but it came out in 2019, right? Tell me, what was your writing process with this book, and how did you get here?
I don't know. My parents, as you guys all know, they're immigrants, and it's hard to make them happy. So, I had to have a professional career and make that money. And so, but that's feeds into part of what the book is about. I think I've known I'm an artist for most of my life. I mean, Adisha, we've had these talks before. I hope they know we go back. We go back. Yeah, we go back.
Well, we've known each other since high school.
Oh.
We used to sing in choir together.
Yes.
With the most unique teacher ever in life that I will never forget, ever. But we used to sing in choir together, and then some organizations, I'm sure, and mutual friends kicked, all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I say that just to say that I knew I was an artist, but I had to do certain things to placate my parents before I started writing. And so part of that was, doing well in school. I was able to go to grad school on scholarship. And I remember the first thing I did when I won that scholarship was I looked around and I said, I can finally do what I want to do. I've given something to my dad, because my dad needs something that he can brag to his friends about when he's sitting on some Sunday afternoon and they're laughing very loudly, that he can say, oh, my son is doing this, and he can feel happy about it. So the question becomes, what do I actually want to do with my life? And once I figured that out, I still had this career that I was interested in, and that I had to kind of, work as hard as I could to ensure that I did well in that career. And I was also figuring out how to write. A number of people who write novels, they do the whole go to school, get the Master in Fine Arts in writing. They get the kind of fellowships that are recognized. I didn't have any of that. I didn't really have any connection to any other writer. I was doing this by myself, after work. I was reading as much as I could. And so I think it was a combination of factors. It was inexperience. It was the fact that I wasn't connected to other writers. It was the fact that I really had to figure out how I wanted to write this, because I wanted to write something that was completely different than anything I'd seen before. And so I think all of those factors contributed to, and I guess the final factor that I'm just remembering now is that I was fortunate enough to win the Caine Prize in 2013. And after I won the Caine Prize, and one of the great things about the Caine Prize is that you're able to kind of travel basically around all these places in the US, all these places on the continent, a few places in Europe as well. And for the first time, I was interacting with people who had read my work. And the story that won the Caine Prize was initially part of the novel. And it was just really interesting to kind of, be in Germany and to be in Berlin and to listen to an audience respond to the story. And then to be in Nigeria, to be in I don't know, like Abuja or something, and hear people respond to the story. And those kind of disparate responses also shaped, I kind of thought about what I was doing. So yeah, I just had to grow,
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So I know, there are definitely a lot of elements that I can tell in the book that are similar to you, Midwest living,
Yeah.
Nigerian American, first generation, love of music.
Yep.
So what, I know a lot of people are wondering, is this really autobiographical? Like, what elements of this are you, where
Yeah.
did you make the decision and the shift
Yeah.
in the book?
Yeah. It's certainly an autobiographical novel. There's a kind of, I don't know if I should call it new, but there's a kind of branch of fiction that's called autofiction, that's gained some popularity in recent years. I'd say over the course of the past 5 or 6 years or so, which is it's the kind of genre in which writers draw extensively from their lives. Now, the reason I'm hesitating in saying that it's been around for the past 5 or 6 years is that writers have been doing this forever, right? Like, I was just reading about this dude that was on America's Next Top Model, talking about he wrote a novel, and it's just about basically how he was beefing with Tyra Banks, right? Like, he's writing from his life. So a lot of people do that. For me, the question becomes, how does the character live on the page? And when I was learning how to write, I spent a lot of time watching YouTube videos, again, because I didn't go to school, and I just I listened to a lot of writers talk about craft and talk about what they were doing. And the thing I was surprised by is that a lot of writers would say that, that their characters were speaking to them. And I used to roll my eyes whenever I heard someone say that, because that just sounded like so much mumbo jumbo to me. But I think for me, what I discovered when I was writing is that it's one thing to kind of live a life and then to tell somebody about the life that you've lived or tell someone about your memories. And it's another thing entirely to kind of try to write that down, because the question becomes, how do you make that live on the page? Because I think for most of us, if you just try to write your life down, like it's kind of boring. And, your mom might like it because she loves you, but if you try to give it to a stranger, they might kind of, throw it in the side or give you the fake smile or whatever. And how do you shape that into something that's compelling and interesting to somebody who isn't you, or somebody who isn't related to you, or somebody who has an obligation to like it because they like you? And I think that's where the craft comes in. And so while there are a lot of elements that are drawn from my life, the timeline is shifted. There are characters who appear in this book who aren't in my life, and vice versa. And I was more interested in telling a story about, about how men can always be trusted, especially when you're trying to construct an identity. I was trying to tell a story about how difficult it is to write about your life. I was trying to tell a story um, about all kinds of things that aren't necessarily related to my life specifically. And so I think because if I had written an autobiography, it'd be a very different book. But because I was writing a book about like the unreliability of memory, about art, about creating art, and how intense a process that is, because I was focused on those things. Uh, those things, those ideas kind of directed the plot, and not so much, I want to tell people about my life and how amazing or interesting it is. So,
Okay. All right.
yeah.
So to you say that, the character speaks to you. So I've always wondered, like, where do these characters go when this book is over? When you finish the book, where are they? Where's Tunde? Where's this, like, where do they go?
Keeping me up at night. You know what I'm saying? Won't let a brother sleep. That's what he's doing.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I've read some different articles about you in this book, and you talk about that you share with Tunde in common that you used to have a fragmented identity. And I was like, oh,
yeah.
Tell me what that means to you, and then how have you reconciled it? Have you reconciled it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think for most of when we met, I was a complete and utter mess, and hopefully I wasn't projecting that into the world, but
I didn't think
I really was. I'm part of that just being in high school, I'm sure, but.
Well, you were very focused, though. I mean,
okay,
that's part of like the Nigerian American life, like you gave out the books in your study.
Absolutely, yeah.
You hid your mess well, I'll say that.
Sorry?
You hid your mess well.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Glad I wasn't out here in these streets just messy. I just felt I didn't know who the hell I was. And I think, again, that's something that a number of immigrant kids experience, especially, the children of Nigerian immigrants experience. And I just was in this place where I wanted my parents to be happy with what I was doing, but I just couldn't figure out I was born and raised in the US, but I'd spent most of my childhood in places that were predominantly white. And so to kind of go into this, I moved to Texas when I was like 14, and moved all around Texas. Not as much as Tunde did, that's another distinction. We moved like maybe 3 times. But by the time I moved to Grand Prairie, which is right next to Arlington, I just was very unsettled in myself. And I think art, I was beginning to understand that like art was maybe one way that I could find a pathway to myself, find a pathway to who I was. But I was also wanting to do well academically so my parents would be happy with me. I was also trying to, figure out something as simple as, how to exist and survive in this, some predominantly Black spaces. I played basketball. That was very important to me. That was a core part of my identity back then. And I was trying to figure out like how to sort of exist in these spaces. And so I was just sometimes careening in the space of an hour from like one identity to the next. I go into one room, I'd be one person, then the next room I'd be another person. And if somebody called me on it, I'd be really pissed off and I'd say, shut up, that's not happening. But it was, and it wasn't until I went to grad school. And the great thing about going to grad school in England was the kind of, I guess the educational system is somewhat different in the UK. It was tutorial based, which meant that I would meet with my tutor once a week. And so what it would happen is that I would sit with him and he would assign me like, a number of books to read and say, by next week, I want a 2,000 word paper on this topic. And so it was up to me to kind of spend the rest of the week writing, which means that I had lots and lots of time to myself. And so this was the first time in my life where I could sit in the room by myself and just spend hours, reading or thinking or doing whatever I wanted to do. And that was the first time where I really had to ask myself, like, who am I, one, and who do I want to be? What do I do? And what do I want to do with my life? Which is not a question I'd really ever asked myself before. The question before had been, how do I ensure that my parents are happy with me? Or how do I ensure that my friends are happy with me? And so that's when I began to really reckon with the fact that I was an artist. And that was really scary. For me, it was kind of like, and I don't mean to at all demean the journey of other people who have like, like really legitimate things going on in their lives. But for me, it was kind of like coming out of the closet because I'd known for a long time that I was an artist, but I couldn't admit it to myself because I knew inevitably I'd have to have that conversation with my parents, especially my dad, in which I said, I want to create art. And I knew that his response would be to roll his eyes or to laugh or something that would be disappointing. And so I think the fact that I was away for a long time and I was able to have these conversations with myself and kind of actually deal with who I was emboldened me to take that step when I did have to have those kind of difficult conversations with other people who had some other sense of what I was supposed to do with my life.
Yeah, I hear that. And that's definitely, I think everybody can understand that concept of having to, shift who you are to be something else you think you need to be. Don't necessarily need to be, especially, like I said, even if you came first generation here or you came from Nigeria straight here, there's always this, I'm trying to be like this person, that person, till you find your ground and your identity. So I think everybody can relate to that on some level for sure. So this one thing, so I think a lot of people, we're reading this and we're trying to figure out what is real, what is not real. I can't tell. I'm confused at some points. I'm like, I just don't know. And I read somewhere that maybe that article, you talk about writing about the blind spot between either and or.
Yeah.
I need you to break that all the way down.
Well, I think there are a couple ways to approach this. I think the first thing I would say is that I grew up in a really religious household. And, I guess one of the things that I learned when I was growing up was that my dad fervently believes in, this other realm that exists that we're constantly interacting with, the idea that there's spirits all around and that are actively playing a role in our lives that we have to think about all the time. And so when I was growing up, this thinking influenced me in a lot of ways. And so I think that's one component of it. The second is that I'm really interested in how memories deceive us and how it's, because I think part of that book drew from the fact that one day a few years ago, I was having a conversation with my brother and I said, do you remember the time? But I said something like, do you remember the time that dad, like punished us or punished me, wouldn't let me go to the park with you guys? My brother said, that never happened. What are you talking about? And I said, no, it happened. You remember, like, he was mad at me. I had to stay home. And my brother said, no, actually, I was the one who stayed home. You got to go. And I thought it was maybe some other incident. And so we both called. First of all, we called my dad. My dad confirmed my brother's version of the story.
Oh.
And then we called they both confirmed my brother's version of the story. And so I thought, wow, because the reason why this was important was because this story had formed a part of my identity. Like I had been aggrieved for much of my life against my brother and my dad for whatever had happened, which actually hadn't happened. And so I began to think about how, just kind of one misplaced memory or one misremembered thing can like really alter your trajectory or alter the way you think about yourself and really set you down this other path too. And the other thing I was thinking about was I wanted to write a story in which uh, the protagonist has a chance to create himself, basically. At one point in the novel, Tunde says is going to write about the future that he doesn't have. Like he's thought about like having this future, but he, for whatever reason, partly because he wants to satisfy his parents, he wants to satisfy other people in his life, he's on this one. So he writes about that path. He writes about the possibility of what he could be. And then at a certain point in the book, he enters that possibility. And I thought it'd be interesting because, again, that's something that I've always thought about doing. And that's what the path of becoming an artist is all about, is at some path I'm on, and I'm going to proactively step in this other direction. I'm going to create the future that I want, and I'm going to inhabit that future. And so, and the thing that, like, for me, the key to understanding the book is thinking about it as, and I wanted to write a book in which.
Rewind, say that one more time. The key to thinking about the book. I think you cut off a
I
little
think
bit.
it's the key to thinking about the book. And here's one thing that talks about her book, right? Because, the writer thinks about, it's really for the reader to discern, and I think that's really important. But from my perspective, I really think about it as like a science fiction novel in some ways, because it's a novel about somebody who like actively creates. In the book, when Tunde says, I can no longer write about myself because I don't trust my memories. So if I can't trust my memories, how in the world can I write about myself? So I'm going to write about this character who does that. He writes about somebody else. He says at one point that he wants to go to this college, but he didn't have the chance. He chose to go to Morehouse instead. So in this imagined scenario, he goes to this other college that he wanted to go to. And then at a certain point, and then he kind of reintroduces himself into the text. He says, I look at her for the first time. And there are clues scattered around the book about who this person might be. And now, if you're a music fanatic who is me, there are a number of things that indicate that this might be a figment of his imagination, this woman that he meets. One, her name is Noelle, and Lauryn Hill's full name is Lauren Noel Hill. And so like he is, and then he introduces the woman by saying, now the joy of my world is in Noel, right? So that's a lyric that's lifted from the Miseducation.
I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
One way of reading the book is that like he's somewhere, he's sitting at his desk, imagining this world for himself. He's loved Lauryn Hill for as long as he can remember. And the woman that he creates for himself is a, if you will, is somebody who is more or less like Lauryn Hill, right? And so
and the locks.
part of this is him like kind of creating this future, which includes creating this woman. And so part of it too is that he falls in love with the woman who doesn't actually exist, right? But that becomes an important part of his process in figuring out who he is, because it's this imaginary woman. If you're reading it that way, I understand if you don't or don't want to, but one way you can read woman, and she is the one who kind of says, get your stuff together, and figure out who you are, and if that means going back to Nigeria. And then even in the last chapter, as somebody who's obsessed with hip hop, I sampled my own book in the last chapter, because the description of his mother matches precisely the description of his stepmother. I lifted that passage. The last part of the book where he's walking around Lagos, and he sees license plates on the wall and carburetors on the floor, is the part that I lifted from the chapter where he goes to sell ice cream with his father, right? Like that is copy pasted. And so this last part of the book could be, if you think about it one way, like again, him imagining what it would be like to meet his mother and how that would help him, or it could be him actually doing that. So as somebody who is obsessed with science fiction and you know, and all kinds of weird stories. I wanted to, you know, if you want to read this book in a conventional way, I wanted the book to work that way. If you're interested in a more kind of surreal, you know, version of it, that version I think works as well.
That just gave me a whole lot of different context of things that I did not even see or connect. I really feel like I need to go back and read this book again with this knowledge so that I can process it in a different way. I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I mean, okay, I have a couple more questions in general, and then I can probably open it up because I know people have a lot of questions about a lot of the themes, mental health, and just, there was a lot in that book. So let's talk about a particular kind of Black man, that the title of the book, and how in different spaces in the book, he kind of focuses on like Brian Gumbel or whoever his father says this is the particular kind of Black man to be. What was that for you growing up? Who did you see, like, this is the particular kind of Black man I need to be? And then again, like, was it in college when you began to redefine that for yourself? This is who I am, because you talked about that a little bit earlier, but who was that for you, I guess, earlier, potentially?
I think that's a great question. When I was younger, my dad, he was very, very strict. And one of the things that he did was he had a schedule that he made for us every day that he would post on the fridge. And we had to like abide by that schedule to the letter, to the number. And we couldn't watch much television. And even when we could watch TV, he would decide what we would watch. And so he was always like watching the TV on his own, and then he would record programs on a VHS. And then when it was time for us to watch TV, he would like pop the VHS into the thing and say, okay, you can watch this. And one of the programs he made us watch was a program. I'm sorry?
I think somebody's talking.
Oh, okay. And one of the programs he made us watch was a movie about Washington. It was this.
No, I think it's just noise. Somebody's popping on and they're not on mute. It's okay.
Okay, all good. This movie about Booker T. Washington and how, you know, he basically, I guess one way of putting it is that he read his way out of slavery. Like, he was born into slavery to get this education and to learn how to read, that he befriended this white woman who saw his potential, and she, you know, taught him how to read. And then he spent, you know, the rest of his life kind of advocating for, to know that there was like a grand conversation that had happened between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And so for a long part of my childhood, I admired him because I was also growing up. I wasn't growing up in slavery. I was on welfare. We were in a bad way. And so for me, that for many years, that was a kind of beacon, this idea that if you worked hard enough, read enough books, that you could, you know, become a success. And so I think that was the model until, again, I went to college and learned that I was supposed to be chilling with, you know, Du Bois and not so much Booker T. Washington. So that was one person. But yeah, my dad was constantly too, like, pointing at the television, a person you should be like. And I think that's a lot for any kid, you know, who is, I mean, all kids are different, but I was definitely a different kid. You know, I was definitely in my own way kind of weird. And I think that my dad saw that, and he was trying to able to craft a life for myself that enabled me to be successful. And that meant, you know, and he was constantly doing things to ensure that would be the case. You know, he made us write, you know, he wanted us to all have perfect penmanship. And so our alphabet, sort of hours at a time. He bought these elocution tapes from the United Kingdom so that we'd learn how to speak a certain way. I mentioned the fact that he programmed our lives. So he was very kind of rigid, and I think part of it too was the fact that he wasn't able to do some of the things that he wanted to do. He was convinced that he didn't make a life for himself in the States that he wanted because of his accent, because of all kinds of things. You know, even as much he wanted to be a professional soccer player, he was, but he didn't reach the level he wanted to reach. And so when I was 5 or 6, he like set up this obstacle course in our backyard that we had to go through every day so that we learned how to, you know, it was funny. I was watching this movie on ESPN a few years back, a 30 for 30. about this quarterback and how he had this crazy dad who was making him lift weights and like study playbooks. And my dad was exactly the same way, except it was with that. But that was his vision of who he wanted us to be, not necessarily. And it wasn't. He never sat me down and said, "Okay, who do you want to be? How can I develop, a template for that?" And so I think that kind of distinction between, and if he was on his call, he'd be very happy with himself. But it took me a long time to get to the other side of 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 this kind of barrier that was in front of me. This barrier that said, "Okay, who are you actually? How do you get there?" And
You're cutting out a little bit. It may just be.
oh, am I?
But it may just be me.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm loving this conversation, and you're giving me a whole lot of insight and things I did not know about you, Tope. So this is interesting.
Okay.
Okay. I have one last question, and then we can just open it up to the readers and see who has some questions. And because there are a lot of themes and topics people were talking about before that they really want to delve into a little bit more, and maybe this gives some more insight. So I know you. So Tope is married. He has 2 daughters. Just had another baby. She's 8 weeks now. 10, 9.
Sorry.
How many weeks is your youngest now?
Oh, she's 8 weeks. She's 2 months this week. Yeah.
So I think in the same way that men grow up with this kind of having to, there's this image they want to be or be like, perceive, someplace they're trying to attain and not always be who they are. I think the same for women. Like we attain, we aspire for this or that, and sometimes don't, just fit in who we are. So with daughters, how are you going to help them not to feel they have to be a particular kind of Black woman? I mean, I know your wife will, she's going to be the mother and facilitate a lot of those things, but as the father, how do you think you're going to help your daughters not have to feel they have to be a particular kind of Black woman?
Yeah, that's something I think about all the I spend a lot of time thinking about. I know I will make mistakes as a parent in the same way that my parents made their own mistakes, and because it's inevitable, I'm a human being. And another part of it too is that my parents created for me, in that for example, my 3-year-old is going to this daycare and she's the only Black girl in her daycare, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, this is insane.
Yeah.
Like it's this cycle. But I think thankfully, because I grew up in this country, I know where a lot of the sort of pitfalls may be, even though I grew up in a different generation. And we're being really proactive about, like, and we might be going, getting her books with, with that feature protagonists, little girls with natural hair, and like, in our own way, we're conditioning her all the time and saying, hey, you're okay, you're fine. Still kind of managed to creep through. Like a couple weeks ago, my daughter was doing, she was doing this a lot. Like she was putting, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, there ain't nothing, what are you here? Like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, my friend, Rachel does this and I like it. And I'm like, wow, she's 3 and already she's like, yeah, like, and I was like beside myself. I'm like, wow, like if she was growing up in a different place, she wouldn't be thinking about these things. And now she, without knowing it, she's like fetishizing this, long hair in a way.
Yeah.
And so of course I might have gone overboard, but I sat her down and said, you're beautiful, your hair is amazing. I did all this stuff, but I don't know. I'm trying my best. Yeah. And I had this moment when I was watching Black Panther when it dropped like a couple years ago. And I was in a theater. I was like maybe the oldest person in the theater. Like the rest of the theater was like young boys and girls, Black boys and girls. And sitting next to this young little Black girl, and she was so excited by what she was seeing on the screen. Her face was like, she was joyful. And I thought, like, this is really powerful, because she's seeing this vision of the kind of person she could be in the future, like a powerful superhero who is doing all kinds of incredible things. And I think that's part of it, like, just ensuring that our kids have access to these images, that they have some way to counteract the narrative that says that they're not enough, or that there's, that they have to become something that they aren't. And that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah. And I think it's going to be a process that I constantly have to fine tune. I might go too far in one direction. And if one of my daughters says to me, hey, chill, relax, and another. So we'll see what happens. But I'm something I think about all the time.
Okay. Well, thank you for indulging me in those questions. That
Thank
was
you for those great
that was
questions.
good stuff, no doubt. So, Zusi, you want anything to add? I just feel like we can open it up to anybody who has questions. Anything you want more insight on, thoughts,
Yeah,
whatever.
I have one quick question before I guess everybody else starts asking questions. I remember there was one quote or statement in the book that kind of stood out to me, and I'll read it really quickly. It states, "I've always known but never admitted to myself with every fiber of my being. I feel like I don't belong here, in this room, at this college, in this country." And as soon as I heard that, I started thinking about the imposter syndrome. And
Yeah.
I was kind of trying to get a better understanding of, from your point of view, I guess, what that means to you.
Yeah. I've certainly felt that way before, and there's like, it's a really scary place to be because I think if you're trying to become a human being and you recognize that there's something wrong with you, or there's something wrong around you, that you don't fit in a certain way, and you're too young to like do something about it. Like if you're old enough and you have enough money, you can get a ticket somewhere and fly away and sit in a room somewhere, or chill, and but if you're too young and your life is being directed by others for whatever reason, that could be a really, really scary place. And I think at this point for Tunde, he's on the verge of having, I don't know if it's a mental breakdown or if he's, just for the first time, he's really confronting the truth of who he might be and how that differs from whoever it is that he's supposed to be. And I think that the contrast between those two things is really weighing on him. So as somebody who's experienced that, I know what that process is. And I kind of experienced that in my own way when I was, I think for me, I was older. I was in grad school when that happened to me, when I said, who the hell am I? What is this? And it's crazy because then you have to question everything that's come before, and think about whether, I'm sorry, my daughter's walling out. So I'm thinking about she's wilding right now. Y'all hear? Okay. So yeah, anyway, I'm thinking about like how this person that you were trying to be, that you're endeavoring to be, that you spent your entire like childhood trying to be, might not be who you actually are, right? And how crazy that is. And so, I went through that in grad school, and thankfully I was in another country, and I could read about it. I could go to, and what I did is that I did a lot of reading. I went to a lot of museums. I went to a lot of plays. I just really kind of grounded myself in art. And for me, that was a really great thing to do. And I, again, found myself on the other side. But I think that, especially for the kids of immigrants, especially the kids of Nigerians, I think it's just really important to, at some point, separate yourselves from your parents' dream of you and your parents' dream of what you're supposed to be. They might think it's in your best interest, and oftentimes it is, but you have to ensure that it's actually something that fits with your vision of yourself as well, that you have a vision of yourself and that you cultivate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we can open it up to questions. Zusi, I think he's got the controls on the mutes, but
It looks like Ned has one.
I can unmute.
you can unmute yourself if you have a question.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tope, for joining us today, and thank you, Adeshewa and Zusi, for putting this together. First, I want to say that story that you told about you having a memory and trying to validate it with your brother, and then having your dad finally confirm it, that literally happened to me this morning.
Oh, really?
That literally happened to me this morning with my sister during one of my other sister's virtual graduation ceremonies. We were reminiscing, and there was a little detail about a memory that I thought happened to her, it actually happened to me.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's real. I just wanted to say that. But my question for you is, we were talking before you got on the call about those moments in the book that were very poetic, where there was a few words on the page, and it was essentially poetry on a page in between the story. And I'm just curious to know who some of your literary inspirations are.
Thanks for that. I think that was my attempt to kind of smuggle some poetry into the book, because before I decided that I'd write fiction, I'd spent like 3 years of my life trying to make it as a poet, like for real. After I worked at Google for a couple years, I was based in London. And when I was working at Google, I became completely obsessed with poetry. I read nothing but poetry for about a year and a half. And one of the reasons I left Google was because I was convinced that I could become a poet. And so like I got this bonus that was more money than I ever seen before. And so I thought, this God is telling me to be a poet. So I packed up, came back to the US. Of course, like 2 months later, the financial crisis happened. So this was back in 2008. And so I was unemployed for about a year and a half. It was really tough. And but I thought this was part of the grand plan. And so, I got a lot of books. I was reading, who was I reading? I read so many people. I started reading people like Mark Strand, for example. He's this, I don't know if you know him, but Charles Schimick is another guy that I was very obsessed with. And then I started reading just a lot of Black poets. So I was reading like Tracy K. Smith, Natasha Trethewey. I was reading Kevin Young. I read and I really became interested in there's this really fascinating movement of Black poets that began in the 80s. They were called the Darkroom Collective. They started at Harvard, and they start because, James Baldwin has just passed away, and they're trying to craft, this, maybe you know everything I'm saying, but they're trying to create for themselves like a new way of creating poetry in the world. And so they invite all these Black luminaries to come by and read to them. And they're constantly talking about the kind of poetry they want to create and how it differs from the poetry that's celebrated in their day. And the great thing about this group is that now they're all like giants in the field. Like many of them have won Pulitzers. They've all done really well with their careers, or they're ensconced at universities around the country. And I was really inspired by that. I thought here's a group of people who have, created their own future. They've written their own future into being. And maybe I can do something like that. The difference with me is that I thought I was going to do it by myself. I was going to start a one-man poetry revolution. And so again, I was writing lots of poetry. I was sending my poems into the world. They were coming back quickly, with their tails between their legs. Nobody was taking them. And so I thought, well, what do I do now? And part of the reason I started writing prose was because I was just wanted to get published, and I always figured I'd get back into poetry. But then I started writing this novel, and so that hasn't happened yet. But that's a long way of saying that I, still wanted to publish a poem. So I can say that I published a poem because I published a poem in my book. And so I'm a claimant,
Anybody feel free to jump in, unmute yourself, ask your question.
Hey, Tope. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey there. So I wanted to, that I found in your book. Obviously, there's lots to unpack. But in kind of the exploration of his girlfriend, or the girlfriend that wasn't there, maybe she was, who knows. I noted the kind of juxtaposition of her and Lauryn Hill, but I also felt like it was a really fascinating way to kind of get him to explore Black love, because his experiences with Black love had been so tainted in many ways throughout his upbringing. So one of the quotes that I kind of fixated on was, "She wants to hold my hand and hands is an affirmation of our mutual belief in the impossible." And that really resonated with me because, of course, love is still in a lot of ways an act of rebellion. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this manifestation of Black love as it really his experiences with his.
All right. I hope I got all your question. It might be my internet connection, but you were cutting in and out a little bit. But if I don't answer it, please let me know, and I'm happy to answer. Yeah, Black love is difficult. It's really, really hard. And I mean, love is difficult anyway, but Black love is another level, right? It's just something that it's incredibly difficult to form a relationship with someone, and for that relationship to survive when, especially in the context of a kind of Black relationship, there are other kind of cultural pressures that might be sort of closing in on that relationship in a way that doesn't happen with other relationships. And so, yeah, this part of the novel was, and you're really adept in pointing that out. And, you know, thank you for reading closely. It was about him finding this space where he could actually exist. The thing about love, if it's really love, is that you can kind of really be who you are with this other person. And that's a really powerful and fascinating and important thing. And for him, he finds this woman, and again, there's an open question about who she actually is, but whatever the case may be, she enables him to kind of be fully himself. And the part that you read from is a place where he's afraid of that connection because he's never had that before, and he doesn't trust that, and he thinks maybe at some point she might turn against him, and so he's trying to like talk himself into what that would be to actually be with someone and to be 100% yourself, and for this person to stick around even when you're being your messiest, most ridiculous self. And that, like, itself is a kind of act of magic, you know. Person, the act of falling in love with somebody is really the act of creating a new reality. And because this is a book that's obsessed with like reality and what is real and what isn't real, and the notion too that I think Black people, we have to actively kind of create the realities we want to inhabit, because the reality we currently inhabit wasn't created for our benefit, right? Like, it wasn't. I'm walking around on a street that wasn't created for me. You know, I'm going to a job that wasn't necessarily, you know, sort of created for my benefit in a way. And so the question becomes, how do you craft that reality that fits the version of who you actually are? And that's what Tunde is doing. And on his journey to getting there, he has to find a person who can be there with him, at least for part of his journey, who can be honest with him and is okay with him being honest about who he is as well. And he's never had that. His dad wants him to be one person. His moms want him to be another person. The people he interact with, you know, like whether they're Black kids, they think he should be one person, and white kids think he should be another person. And this is the first person in his life who says, who you are is cool, you know, just embrace it. That's a radical thing, especially as a Black person. That's so radical because I think so much of us spend so much of our lives trying to we're trying to contort ourselves in order to be successful and to be accessible, for people to get us. And part of the message of this book is like, you know, F that, you know, who are you actually? And why can't you create a reality around who you are actually? You know, why can't you do that?
Question. Thank you. That was such a great point. Actually, my question stems off of that. I appreciate you pulling out the theme of memory. It just sparked my thought during this call. So as I look back to the book, I feel like there were two major themes of memory and expectations. And I really enjoyed the part where you stated that you wrote to have control, you wrote for clarity. And clarity, I guess, could be seen as an ever-evolving concept in one's life. But at what point did you feel like you arrived at some sense of clarity or an enhanced sense of clarity? Was that happening throughout the process of this book, or maybe before you even started your own clarity?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you point out something that for me is really important, and that's like the act of making art was for me part of my journey to clarity. I like the way you put it, because, you know, like the thing about writing or creating any kind of art is that you really have to face yourself in a way. You know, like when you're sitting down and you're confronting this blank page and you're trying to put something on it, and you're dealing with insecurities you might have about your ability to do this. You're dealing with insecurities about what you have produced and whether it's meaningful to somebody else. There's always that frightening moment when you send the piece, whether it's a piece of writing or a piece of art or visual art or a film or something, to somebody you respect, and you wait for what they might have to say, and you're like sort of checking your inbox every few seconds like this because you don't actually want to read it, but you do, you know. All those moments are, I think, really kind of important markers on the pathway to selfhood, on the pathway to realizing who you actually are. And so, yeah, the thing about creating art is that you have to be you have to be naked. You have to put yourself out there, and you have to be honest about where you are in the trajectory in terms of developing your craft, in terms of connecting I don't want to get too mystical here, but I think if you want to create something that's meaningful, you have to connect to your source in a way as well. And all of these things aren't practices that are kind of encouraged in your day-to-day life. For example, if you get up in the morning and go to your, kind of job where you're meant to be buttoned down and present a certain version of yourself, like that's not a space where you can be fully yourself. And sometimes even the space within the space of your relationship, right? Not even if you're with somebody you care about deeply, sometimes you have to like hold back a certain part of who you are in order for the relationship to work, and so art is kind of a place where you have to strip all that away if you want to create something that's meaningful. And so I think for me, the process of making art was, again, a pathway to figuring out who the hell I am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have another question. This is more of a fun question. The as part of the book that actually made me laugh out loud was when his father told Tunde to not touch the dry ice.
Yeah.
And then he still touches it.
Yeah.
And I was like, good for you.
Yeah.
That part
That's
really like I had to stop and just I had a nice hearty laugh in that moment because I can think of so many moments. I've heard that same thing from my parents. So is that, I'm not sure if the ice cream story really happened or the ice cream truck. I'm just curious to know if any of that actually happened to you or.
Yeah, a lot of it did. My dad did drive an ice cream truck when I was, I must have been like, let's see, 10 or 11. And the thing, it's easy to write Nigerian men because we're all crazy. We're all walking stereotypes, basically. It's incredibly easy to write Nigerian men. You've written one, you've written all of them. So, yeah, that was, and if you want to write my dad is such a comical guy, and he doesn't even recognize it, There's so many anecdotes on the cutting room floor. Like I remember one time, my mom was, she was giving us meat, for dinner or something. And she made a mistake and gave me a bigger piece of meat than she gave my dad. My dad, first of all, we were sitting down and my dad he went silent. And we're like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Then he started looking at my plate. He said, is he now? Are you married to him now? He lost it. And all of us are like, are you serious? I can give this thing to you. But he just completely lost it. He lost it. And so, and he would do these things all the time. And we loved him, like that's just who he is. He's this crazy guy. But yeah, there's Nigerian men are like that. And so, yeah, I like poking fun at him. And I do to this day. And he doesn't get the joke. But, it's still really easy to kind of capture that kind of hyper masculine aggression that so many Nigerian men seem to embody,
I mean, you can hear our laughter because everybody is feeling all of that. Like, I know that's happened in my household. I know it has. I know it has.
My last question, I promise.
Yeah.
So we've heard about, I guess, talk about the poet, the author. Just curious, what's next? Do you have anything else in the works or anything we can expect from you in the next couple years?
Yeah, I'm writing a novel. It's not going as fast as I would like because I have this day job. I was traveling, but COVID said sit your butt down. So I'm here chilling in the crib right now. But then, yeah, the newborn, there's a lot happening right now. I really, really want to produce as much as I can. And so, it's funny, like my dad's sort of scheduling has infected my brain. So I wrote this timeline and I said, by July, I hope to be able to carve out 2 or 3 hours a day to write. And I really want to get a draft done, if possible, by the end of the year or early next year. So we'll see if that happens. But I have an idea for a novel, and I hope that I have the time to pull it off. So.
What's the idea?
I can't even, it's so delicate now.
Ow.
I don't want to expose it to air. It's so delicate.
You're going to share it. Okay. All right. Keep your secrets.
But I have a quick question.
Hey.
Oh, go for it.
You say I can go? I had a question about if the dad went through just a series of disappointments in life. from, you know, this grand scheme of going to Utah and becoming the living American dream. And I wanted to know if the parts of his life, his father's life, mirrored anything experienced in your family, of this the constant kind of disappointment of being in America. There was one point where Tunde said something like he was always waiting for his dad to talk about the part where he was like chased out by war, or like somehow like banished from Nigeria, which prevents him from going back. So I'm curious to know what part of his dad's experience may have mirrored your experience, or your family's experience, or what you drew from to create that character.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess the one thing I noticed in my dad was this kind of stunted, that's not even the word for it, this kind of unfulfilled ambition. My dad is just a terribly ambitious person. And he's also really, really talented. He's really bright. He's charismatic. He's engaging. I mean, in some other universe, like, he had a completely different life. And when I was growing up, I sensed that it was like this energy, this force in the room whenever I was with him. This idea that, like, I want to be something else. I want to be, you know, I want to be on television talking about some policy that I've enacted. I want to be in charge of some massive corporation, but for whatever reason, I'm not able to do that. And I felt the weight of that when I was growing up. I felt the weight of these kind of unmet expectations, this kind of this unfulfilled ambition. And I think that's one reason when I was younger as well, I kind of pushed myself. My dad was pushing me, of course, but my mom was as well. But I also pushed myself because I was terrified of, like, that life. And so for me, for a long time, life was about ensuring that there was never a point when you would look at yourself and say, I've not fulfilled this ambition. But of course, I don't think one can construct a life on that alone. There has to be other things, and it took me a while to recognize that. But even to this day, I feel sad when I think about what he could have been, and how that was, for various reasons, he wasn't able to achieve those things because of this country, racism, any number of things seem to conspire against him. If I talk to him now, he would say that he's living through his kids and he's happy and he's content. But I know, because I'm so ambitious, you know, I know what it means to kind of go to sleep at night and think about all the things that you could be doing that you're not doing, and try to figure out how to get to those places. And so, and I think too about the sacrifice that involves. I mean, there's, again, in some other universe, my dad stayed in Nigeria, and he would often tell us, you know, when I was, you know, growing up, he would say, oh, my friend now, we used to run around the yard together in Nigeria. Now he's a big man in Nigeria now. He's a big man. And obviously he was saying, in contrast, my son is getting a bigger piece of meat now. And so look how my life is falling apart. I mean, this guy is, you know, doing big things in Nigeria. And so, yeah, I was aware of that. And I also thought about the sacrifice he made in coming over here, partly thinking about his unborn children. And so, yeah, that's another weight that you carry around, like, okay, gosh, I have to do well, because now I'm not living only for myself, but for this guy as well, to ensure that he didn't come here for no reason. So yeah, that was definitely a major part of my life. And I think about my, hopefully not that, but there'll be something else that they have to carry into the future that I'm burdening them with right now as we speak. So I guess it's just the way it is.
Yeah, I think I forget who said it. Someone said giving the gift of freedom to your children.
Yeah,
I think that's really hard because you do put all these things on them. Sometimes consciously saying you need to be a doctor, or sometimes unconsciously through the comments you make, or like the gentle steers you give your kids. And I think as children of immigrants, you feel like you owe your parents something. And Nigerian parents are not shy about telling you that you do in fact owe them these things.
Yeah.
And so it's always hard to kind of like to think about it in your mind and release yourself from this obligation that you didn't know you had, that your parents have indebted you with, but still wanting that like check mark of approval that they're happy, or so you want to see them sad and suffering, and it's a weird, delicate balance of who's first, you or them. Though I think it should be you, but you can't escape the wanting to make them proud.
Yeah, the other side of it though is that I am glad that my parents did force me to work hard in school, because you know, I'm glad that I have this other career. I'm really happy about that. And I'm glad too that, more important than that, that I know what it takes to do well, like this kind of work ethic. And that's directly from my parents. And that's directly too from them insisting that I do well in school, that I push myself. And so, I mean, there are some people who decide they want to be creative and they're 13 or 14, and their parents put all these resources into them to kind of ensure that they do that. And they publish their first book when they're 20 or something. And I think that's great. If that's your pathway, that's fine. But I'm glad that that I was able to kind of engage with the world in this kind of robust way. And that I had to find myself back to being an artist. I think for me that worked. The funny thing is, when I was on book tour, and even before, when I was traveling after the Caine Prize, every place I went, every single place I went, there was some Nigerian who would approach me, or Nigerian American who would approach me at the end, and they would say, it was all the same approach. They would say, I'm a doctor, but I'm also like a painter. I'm a doctor, but I'm also a writer. And so I think it's also interesting, like how so many of us are so creative as well. And for whatever reason, our parents don't always account for that, And when you think about it, it's not that unusual. My dad talks about my grandfather singing or playing the drums or so like art has always been a crucial part of who we are. But for whatever reason, sometimes that doesn't make it across the ocean. Now they're saying, okay, this is not a reliable pathway to success. Now you go get your MD, or go get your JD, or go become an engineer. And there's no kind of discussion about whatever it is that might be inside of you that's struggling to get out. And so my parents weren't able to provide that piece of it, but I'm glad that I would not have published this book if I didn't have the kind of discipline that my dad and my mom had forced on me when I was younger. So both parts are key for me.
All right. Well, it's about 3:30, so I know I'm going to honor your time. So I know I told you about an hour. So thank you so much for joining us and giving some great conversation and context and background. So this has been awesome. I'm very happy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been just a pleasure. Happy to answer more questions at any point. I think now, or Adeshewa has my info. Thank you so much for reading the book. It means the world to me, and for doing this on a Saturday. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And great questions, Adeshewa, like, honestly.
Oh, thank you, girl.
Do you do this? Do you moderate discussions like normally?
I used to have an entertainment site back in the day, so I did interviews like all the time. So one of my loves, So this brought me back. I was like, oh, get some stuff. What'd you say?
Multi-talented Nigerian.
Right.
Thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, Zusi, did you have any closing remarks?
No, we covered it. Thank you so much again, Tope.
Thank you so much.
Definitely check us out on Jollof Gist on Instagram, and it's pretty much an organization that we started in 2017 just to bring Africans together in the DMV area. And so we do events. We have different subgroups like the book clubs, the finance groups. We have a fitness group, and primarily the main reason was just to have folks with similar backgrounds together, mostly Africans and Caribbeans, to come together and just be able to connect and grow together and build these strong relationships. So this book again hit home for a lot of us, and so we're really excited to talk about it. So many emotions that we're going through, each of us when we're reading it. So we're so thankful for you to be here today to kind of answer these pressing questions we had. So
thank you so much for having me and for getting this together. I really, really appreciate it.
One last thing, what are your contacts? Like, you're not on Instagram, are you? But you're on Facebook.
I lurk on Instagram. I'm so lazy.
I try to we try to tag you. I couldn't even find your Instagram, which is hilarious.
Yeah, I'm definitely more of a presence on Twitter. So
share your handles and stuff, please.
It's at TOPEFOLARIN on Twitter. I forgot my Instagram handle because I'm never on the gram, but I can figure that out. I'm gonna start posting right now.
Get it together, sir.
Get it together.
Get it together.
But Twitter, I'm definitely on Twitter and Facebook, and let's see, am I on anything? I think that's it. So,
does your book, what do you call your book publisher, whatever, do they have a specific handle for your book or anything like that? Any particular?
I think no, I think it was when the book dropped, I think it was like hashtag a particular kind of black man or APKOM. I think that's what it was, but who knows if that hashtag is still alive. It's out there. Out there struggling. So
all right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for your questions and the great discussion we had. So we meet again, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.